and he's the maker of mobile apps in downtown Denver. And without further ado, we'd like to introduce Mr. Chris Floyd.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be asked here tonight by the Aurora History Museum to present and to talk to you a little bit about my experiences growing up as a gamer. I'd also like to thank you for being here and supporting this institution. I admit, before I was invited to speak, I didn't know there was an Aurora History Museum, but it's a fantastic institution to have in a city like Aurora, and it's great to have people support it. So when I was asked to speak, I was told the topic was about growing up as a gamer, and that brought a whole lot of things to my mind. As somebody who grew up in the early days of video games, but I also thought of something else, which is my kids, who themselves are growing up as gamers. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is how my generation of gamer is different from my kids' generation, how the gaming landscape is different between them. And I'm going to talk about just a handful of games, really, that hopefully illustrate that difference. And also along the way, maybe you'll learn a little bit about how games are developed and game design. First, since we're at a history museum, a quick history lesson. You can get a much better history lesson down the hall. But in the late 50s, early 60s is really when the first video games, original video games, were created for computer systems. This game here that they're playing in this image is called Space War. And it involves using these little switches they had to move spaceships around on the screen there and try to shoot each other with missiles. So before this point, you maybe had computers running chess programs or tic-tac-toe and derivative games that already existed. But something like Space War is generally considered pretty close to the first original video game. By the early 70s, you had a little bit of these video games coming into the mainstream consciousness, with systems like Pong showing up in bars and restaurants being enormously successful. And not too long afterwards, you had home video game systems like the Atari, which was made by the people who made Pong. By the early 80s, you had kids like me packing into arcades and playing who knows what from a library of hundreds of games that were available to be played, and the industry was booming. So I was one of those kids. I probably wore those really short shorts, just like that. I don't know why anyone let us do that. But what I want to point out is, these guys, the very first game developers, that's pretty momentous. But just as momentous is these kids over here are the first kids who are growing up pretty much their whole lives with a brand new medium of video games. So what can we say about this first generation of gamers? Well, they're growing up in terms of games in a very dynamic environment. The technology has just barely started. It's building into finding new ways, new systems are coming out all the time, new genres of games are being invented, and these first gamers are devouring this stuff as soon as it's coming out. They're very curious, they're energized by the newness of all the stuff that's around them. Again, there's really been nothing like these games before. At the same time, some people around them find games to be a little bit weird, kind of pointless. I sort of think of this first gamer generation like Wall-E. You've seen the movie Wall-E. He's sort of cobbled together from whatever parts were available at the time. Kind of like these gamers, their gaming experience is put together by the pieces. Stuff that's just being developed right at that very moment. But he finds wonder around every corner. And some people might look at him and think he's kind of a little sad or a little lost, falling around in his junkyard. But Generation 2 is different. Generation 2 has grown up with games as a fully developed media industry. It's huge. It's bigger than movies now in terms of gross product. These kids are immersed in games pretty much everywhere they go and everywhere they look. There's all kinds of systems available now, and including mobile devices, right? Handheld, they can take games anywhere they want. And really, games aren't new or exotic or weird to hardly anybody anymore. We've learned they're part of the media landscape for us. So that's Generation 2, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about how they're similar or different from the first gamer's generation. But I want to point out, well, who's making the games that Generation 2 is playing right now? Well, it's this kid who was playing Q*bert in the arcades. Now he's grown up and he's a game developer. It's me. Now, like any artist, if I may, game developers have influences. They take games that they remember playing and enjoying, and they try to push the limits, push the boundaries, experiment with them, and see what else they can make from some of these same ideas. So, what might a game developer from this generation think of? Well, he might think about Q*bert, which he played in arcades. But there might be other places that he ran across games, even in school. He might think about this game. Anyone recognize that game? Oregon Trail. Now, a lot of people have played this game. In fact, a lot of non-gamers are familiar with this game from their time in school. Oregon Trail, there was earlier versions, I think came out earlier in the 70s, but the Apple II version really, I think, is the one most people remember, and I believe it's from 1985. It's a game about life and death as a pioneer. It's really an extraordinary game, and then from a game design perspective, it's a fantastic game. A lot of educational games kind of get a bad rap. People think, you know, they're not great games because they're trying too hard to teach you something. Oregon Trail is a fantastic example, I think, of both. When it comes to influences, I've sort of picked this as an example because just in the last few years, you've started to see game developers draw on, very clearly, as you'll see, on Oregon Trail, their memories of Oregon Trail. For example, in 2010, someone made a game called So Long, Oregon, Let's Go Find El Dorado, which involves taking your little Conestoga wagon and jumping it off of mountains, flipping it around in circles in the air, driving through Indian villages and picking up smallpox. The gameplay ultimately is not really fundamentally like Oregon Trail, but you see it tracks your food and the health of the people on your little trip, and it's obviously meant to be a little bit silly. There's also Super Amazing Wagon Adventure, came out just recently. As you might be able to tell, it's sort of a frantic shooter, but again, it has elements like tracking your different people in your party. You still ford rivers. You also can jump over them. If I recall correctly, fly into space. In the process, it's pretty silly. And then there's a game like Oregon Trail, which is your station wagon west to escape the zombie apocalypse. So now these are examples of what we today call indie games. You're not necessarily going to see like direct examples of Oregon Trail coming out of a major publisher, but actually a lot of guys who make these indie games, they're game developers for bigger companies, and they do the indie work on the side. But clearly, they remember their games from their childhood, and it affects them. So let me take the personal angle here. In 1983, the Apple IIe came out. I got one of these probably 1984, 1985. My dad brought one home to me for our family. He was convinced computers were a big thing. He was not a very technical person, but the Apple IIe had 64K of RAM. Put things in perspective, modern computers have 125,000 times more memory than this computer did. I was extremely excited when I upgraded this to 128 kilobytes of RAM. I could play a whole bunch of games I couldn't play before. It also had monochrome graphics. That means one color. It was green. And we loved it. Not too long after I got the Apple II, a friend of the family a little bit older than me. He was fairly computer savvy at the time. Came by and brought a disc, of course one of those big 5¼ inch floppy discs that had a game on it. And this was the first game, it wasn't the first game I played, it was the first game I owned and played over and over and over. It was a game called Karateka. Came out in 1984, and here's what it looked like in glorious monochrome. Now, if I were to try to describe the game to you, the first thing I might do is tell you a little bit about what happens. In Karateka, you try to rescue the princess from the warlord's fortress by defeating all his minions with your awesome karate. Actually, a lot of people might describe a game this way, but it's not a very good way to describe a game. So, if I really want to explain what Karateka is like, well, maybe actually, this might work well for describing a movie or a novel, but let's try some pictures. And here's what it looked like in color. Eventually, I got a color monitor for my Apple TV, and I got to enjoy 4 colors. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. Does this tell you anything more about what the game is like? Well, maybe, okay, you're kicking guys, hurting them. There's these triangles down here. I'm not real sure what those are about. While I'm on the subject of how it looks, though, I mean, this is actually a very beautiful game. And if you ever get a chance, you might be able to find some online to see this game in motion. It has amazing, very smooth animations, all these karate moves. It's really pretty innovative. And this is some beautiful artwork, I think, considering you have 4 colors and these huge pixels. But again, I don't think the pictures do a very good job of describing the game. So I want to talk about Karateka the way the game designers talk about the game. And one way we do is with this concept of game loops. So a game loop is an activity in a game that you do over and over and over. And every time you do something, the computer responds with some kind of feedback. So the player acts and the game reacts. But the key about game loops is that every game loop is made up out of smaller game loops that take less time and are smaller scale decisions. So let me describe Karateka as a game loop. Well, at the top level, the loop of Karateka is playing the game from start to finish. Now, it may not seem like a loop, it may seem like it starts somewhere and then it ends somewhere, but actually, because it only took 20 minutes to win Karateka, and most likely you were going to die a few minutes in anyway and try again, you ended up playing this game over and over again, even if you were pretty good at it. You'd watch the lovely intro, you'd fight a whole bunch of guys, you'd rescue the princess, and you'd get your little finale at the end. Now the smaller loops inside that big loop are mainly 16 combat encounters that you have with these different minions of the warlord, one-on-one battles. And so when we analyze that next level of the game loop, you say, well, this loop is to engage with one of these enemies and either defeat him or be defeated. You do this by attacking him and trying to take down his hit points before he takes down yours. These little triangles, when one of them goes to 0, these ones go to 0, you're done. When his go to 0, he's defeated, you move on and fight the next one. Well, that game loop has a smaller game loop inside that. And these are the second by second decisions that you're making about what kind of attacks you want to make, or do you want to go on